The image of the medieval knight is one of shining armor, noble deeds, and unwavering honor. When we think of the Code of Chivalry, it is often through the lens of romanticized tales where brave warriors defend the helpless, protect the church, and fight with fairness on the battlefield. Yet the truth about this so-called code is far more complex. It was not a single written law that every knight memorized and followed. Instead, it was an evolving set of ideals, expectations, and social rules that often clashed with the brutal realities of the Middle Ages. The code was as much about appearances and political necessity as it was about genuine morality. The very origins of chivalry show how intertwined it was with power. In the early medieval period, knights were not yet the gallant figures we imagine today. Many were simply armed men, hired to serve kings or lords, and their loyalty could be bought or swayed. Warfare was chaotic, and knights often behaved like warlords, raiding and pillaging without restraint. The church, seeing the damage these warriors inflicted on society, began promoting moral guidelines for their conduct. Councils such as the Peace and Truce of God tried to limit the days knights could fight, and encouraged them to protect the weak. Over time, these moral appeals became part of the growing cultural identity of knighthood. By the 12th century, chivalry had taken on a more defined shape, but it was never truly consistent. A knight was expected to serve his lord faithfully, defend the church, protect the poor, and conduct himself with courtesy toward women of noble birth. However, this code was not applied equally. The poor might receive a knight's protection in theory, but in practice, peasants were often treated as expendable. Courtesy was largely reserved for high-born ladies, not for servant girls or the wives of farmers. Chivalry was deeply rooted in the rigid social hierarchy of medieval Europe, and it reinforced the idea that nobility was inherently more worthy of respect and protection. Literature played a huge role in shaping the popular image of chivalry. Epic poems and romances like the Song of Roland and the Arthurian legends painted knights as paragons of loyalty, bravery, and moral purity. These stories were entertaining, but they also served as propaganda, inspiring knights to model themselves after these fictional heroes. In reality, the battlefield left little room for poetic ideals. Knights killed without hesitation, often with the goal of capturing enemies for ransom rather than sparing them out of honor. Duels were not always fair, and deception was not uncommon in warfare. Chivalry sounded noble, but survival and victory often came first. One of the most misunderstood aspects of the code is its connection to religion. Knights were expected to uphold Christian values, attend Mass, and defend the faith against heretics and infidels. This ideal fueled the Crusades, where knights traveled to the Holy Land under the banner of religious duty. However, these campaigns were often brutal and merciless, with atrocities committed on all sides. Looting and slaughter were not in line with the peaceful teachings of the Church, yet they became a part of these supposedly holy missions. Chivalry could be used to justify violence, as long as it was done in the name of God or one's lord. The treatment of women under the chivalric code is another area where the truth is far from the romantic image. In literature, knights would risk their lives for the honor of a lady, pledging eternal loyalty and performing grand gestures of devotion. In reality, marriage was often a political arrangement, and women had little control over their own fates. While a knight might show courtesy and restraint toward a noblewoman, the code did not stop him from seeing her as part of his lord's property or a means to secure an alliance. The idea of courtly love, so central to chivalric tales, was more of a poetic game than a widespread practice. Chivalry also served as a tool for political stability. A knight who followed the code was less likely to rebel or act purely for personal gain. The ideals of loyalty and service bound him to his lord, ensuring that military power stayed under control. Feasts, tournaments, and ceremonies reinforced these bonds, reminding knights of their place in the feudal order. Tournaments, in particular, were both entertainment and training, where knights could display their skill and bravery under the watchful eyes of lords and ladies. These events also provided a way for knights to compete without causing the destruction of open warfare. Yet chivalry was selective in its morality. While knights were expected to treat fellow Christians with a certain level of respect, enemies from other faiths or foreign lands were often excluded from such courtesy. Prisoners of noble birth might be treated with care and held for ransom, but common soldiers could be slaughtered without remorse. This selective compassion shows that chivalry was never a universal moral code, but rather a set of rules that reinforced class distinctions and political interests. By the later Middle Ages, the gap between the ideal and the reality of chivalry was becoming even more obvious. As warfare evolved with the introduction of gunpowder and professional armies, the traditional role of the knight began to fade. The code still held cultural power, but it was often more symbolic than practical. Kings and nobles continued to celebrate chivalric ideals in ceremonies and literature, even as the brutal realities of war remained unchanged. In many cases, chivalry became a form of nostalgia, a way to cling to an image of honor in a world that was becoming more politically and technologically complex. It is also important to recognize that not all knights ignored the spirit of chivalry. There were individuals who truly tried to live up to its ideals, defending the helpless, showing mercy to their enemies, and holding themselves to high moral standards. However, these figures were exceptions rather than the rule. The demands of loyalty, ambition, and survival often outweighed the call for compassion and fairness. The fact that these truly honorable knights stood out so much is evidence of how rare it was for the code to be fully practiced. Chivalry's lasting impact is undeniable, even if its reality was flawed. The idea that warriors should be bound by a moral code has shaped military ethics for centuries. Modern concepts of honor, respect for civilians, and fair treatment of prisoners of war owe something to the medieval ideal, even if they are applied far more universally today. The romantic image of the knight in shining armor still captures the imagination, serving as a symbol of bravery and nobility, even if history tells us that the truth was far less perfect. The truth about the Code of Chivalry, then, is that it was as much about image as it was about action. It provided a framework for behavior, but one that was applied unevenly and often bent to serve the needs of those in power. It was a blend of moral aspiration, social control, and political convenience. Wrapped in the glittering armor of romance and legend, while it inspired some to live better lives, it also allowed others to justify acts that were anything but noble. In the end, chivalry was less a strict moral compass and more a cultural performance. Knights were expected to play their part, reciting the right vows, showing the proper courtesy, and appearing loyal, even when their actions told a different story. Like many ideals in history, it was easier to praise than to practice. And yet the allure of chivalry endures because it speaks to something deeply human. The desire to believe that even in times of war and chaos, there can be honor, respect, and courage. Whether or not the knights of the past truly lived by this code, the dream of such a world continues to inspire, reminding us that ideals, however flawed, can still hold power across the centuries. If you want, I can also write you a follow-up piece exploring the most famous examples of knights who broke the chivalric code in shocking ways, to show how reality clashed with the ideal. Would you like me to prepare that? So, after peeling back the polished armor and stepping away from the storybook pages, we see that the Code of Chivalry was never as flawless as legend would have us believe. It was part ideal, part social control, and part performance, designed as much to maintain power and order as to inspire noble acts. Knights could speak the language of honor and loyalty, while still acting in ways that were ruthless and self-serving. Yet despite its contradictions, chivalry left behind something that still resonates today. The idea that warriors should be bound by a moral standard, that strength should be tempered with mercy, is one of its most enduring legacies. It is why we still picture knights as symbols of courage, even if reality was messier than the myth. Perhaps that is the real magic of chivalry. Not that it was perfectly followed, but that it kept alive the hope for a better way of living and fighting, even in an age defined by conflict. And maybe, just maybe, that hope is worth carrying forward. After all, the world could still use a little more honor, a little more respect, and a little more courage.